Hello everyone, this is Puny Army, and I'm later to this video than I'd like, I'll admit. My friends who watched my previous video recommended I put background music in, and I decided rather than using stock audio, I would create my own music, so that's what you're listening to in the background. And since I'm too far after the Call of Duty update to speak about that really, I decided to instead release my series of tests on the Kilo 141. Now, keep in mind ahead of time that most attachments for guns change your gun stats on a percentage basis. This will become important later. We're going to start with the Kilo 141 with absolutely no attachments. This is the default recoil. Notice that after 20-ish bullets that the Kilo 141 ceases to really have much in the way of vertical recoil. Instead, it kicks left. This is fairly interesting because once you get used to this, being accurate with the Kilo past 20 bullets is insanely easy. Now, the next thing we're going to test is a Kilo 141 with just compensator attached to it. And this is the compensator only. You'll notice that the vertical recoil has changed drastically. There's a much tighter cluster vertically. It almost exclusively kicks left. There was very little vertical recoil. Now, when we test this again with 3 recoil control enhancing attachments, it's a much different story. Now, I didn't realize until later that this wall wasn't exactly ideal, but if you look where the red circle is, you will see that the vertical recoil is much higher now, and this leads me back to the point where the attachments change based on a percentage. See, the recoil control between the increases from the 3 attachments were cumulatively less effective. They had diminishing returns, in other words, compared to the loss of aiming stability 2 of them gave. So the 2 attachments that you can equip that increase recoil control also decrease aiming stability, which increases the amount you feel the recoil. So, in other words, the decreases to aiming stability outweighed the increases to recoil control, thus creating higher vertical recoil. So, what this essentially means is that for guns with already high recoil control and aiming stability like the Kilo, increases to recoil control or aiming stability aren't going to mean as much to a gun with lower aiming stability or recoil control, which will feel the enhancements of attachments much more. So when you're considering attachments for a weapon, it really matters what the default stats of the weapon are, because those changes are percentage based. So for the Kilo 141 here, as you saw earlier, there really isn't much reason to attach more than 1 recoil control attachment to the Kilo unless you're decreasing its recoil control with another attachment. Essentially speaking, for the most part, the Kilo doesn't need a whole lot of attachments in terms of recoil control. Furthermore, because the Kilo loses a lot of its vertical kick upon shooting past 20-ish 25 bullets, this means that extended mags for the Kilo tend to be a little better than sleight of hand, since this means that you can effectively shoot for longer much straighter than guns with similar ammo pools. The actual needs of the Kilo depend primarily upon what range you're going to be playing it at. For example, if you're going to be playing it at a mid-ish to long range, you'll be needing a scope for that, and then your needs are based primarily around how much aiming stability you'll need to continuously fire accurately at long range. To that end, we need to look at the default aiming stability of the Kilo visually. We'll start with the VLK, which is a 3x scope. This is the Kilo 141 with the VLK 3x scope, and as you can see, the vertical recoil is felt more, but the leftwards kick isn't. This is the Kilo with the sniper scope, which is a 4.4 times. Again, you'll see the vertical recoil jump even more than with the VLK. Now, this is not really bad aiming stability. It's not a huge change in the Kilo's vertical recoil based on the aiming stability. And in this particular case, aiming stability is simply how much more the recoil is felt based upon the particular zoom of the scope. Obviously, as you saw there, the higher the zoom, the more you're going to feel that recoil. Now, I'm not going to give some kind of kilo build here that's the ultimate kilo build, because quite honestly, what works for you is going to be different based on how you play compared to how I play. What works for me is probably going to be different from what specifically works for you, so I'm not going to do that. I will, over the next 3 videos, discuss variations of kilo builds, mostly through the use of either blueprints or imitations of blueprints, and comment on the strengths and weaknesses of these blueprints in brief, before summing up blueprints of a particular category, long, medium, or short range, with a general, well, this is what I use for long range kilos, and here's why this particular works, and here's why I use these attachments, etc. I'll be doing specific videos for that later on. For this video, I'm going to just give out some general tips for the kilo that all players can use, not a specific build, but just some specific tips. Starting with the recoil control. Unless you're attaching no stock to the kilo, you really don't need more than 1 recoil control enhancement. If you are running no stock and you slap on 2 attachments that increase recoil control, unless one of them doesn't decrease your aiming stability, you'll probably need some form of aiming stability enhancement as well. If you're running what I call a mid-range scope, which is between 3 and 4 times zoom, you're really going to need 1 aiming stability increase. If you're running the sniper scope, I would seriously consider 2 aiming stability boosts. You only need 1 source of recoil stabilization to really counter that leftwards kick. 2 recoil stabilizations don't really help, because as stated earlier, the adjustments to a weapon stats for the most part are percentage based, and therefore you're not going to see enough of an impact from the second recoil stabilization. So either choose the muzzle brake or the commando foregrip if you're going to be using a scope. The commando foregrip works really well if you're going to use a scope and also want that recoil stabilization. If you're not using a scope, you're almost always going to want to go with muzzle brake. The only real question you have to ask yourself is, if you really want to silence the kilo, how do you do that? And what I'm going to tell you might surprise you, or you might already know this, but if you pay very close attention when you're equipping a suppressor of most kinds, depending on the gun, you're going to see an increase in recoil control, and that's because the suppressor's weight decreases your vertical recoil a little bit, not a whole lot, not as much as, say, a compressor or a specialized attachment to decrease recoil control, but you will see a little bit more recoil control with just a suppressor than with nothing at all. And also you're going to see a little bit more recoil stabilization, not really so much that you probably notice except on really extreme unstable guns, such as, say, the like a lot of the SMGs, you'll notice a slight decrease in left to right kick if you suppress them. I can't think of any off the top of my head as a specific example, but I will show you as I do those guns in their own series. Anyways, that's really something to keep in mind. So if you're attaching a suppressor, you probably can give up either recoil stabilization or, more likely, some recoil control attachment. And that's pretty important to note, especially considering the fact that the Whisper barrel that the Kilo has is only really useful in the CDL matches, because you can't equip suppressors in that, depending on the rule set at the time. They've been banned before, so it's worth noting that the Kilo can use a suppressed barrel and still be legal. So that's really the only situation I recommend the Whisper barrel in, specifically as a general rule. Otherwise, you're generally going to want to slap a suppressor on and give up a recoil control enhancing attachment for the Kilo. Otherwise, really at that point, it's a matter of experimentation. But that's all really that I have to say on the Kilo 141 without getting into specific playstyles, which will be the next video, starting with longer range engagements, which is really where the Kilo kinda shines with some important caveats, but I'll discuss those in the next video. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and have a pleasant day.